In this video I got a whole pile of knives I'm going to be going over. Top 10 bushcraft knives under $50. Each of these knives I personally selected and tested here in Alaska. Before we get into the specific knives, I think it's important to cover what this term bushcraft means, because it's a pretty widely used term, but for the purposes of this video I'm looking mostly at the craft of outdoor living, of wilderness living, the different skills involved in that. Again, for the purposes of knives and for this video, I want to separate bushcraft from survival. There's obvious overlap between those two. You're going to need bushcraft skills to survive, but survival is a little bit more of a short-term thing. Hopefully you're trying to get back to civilization, whereas with wilderness living, you're doing it on purpose. The reason I'm making the distinction between survival and bushcraft is because the kind of knives that are ideal for each of those are a little bit different. They can be interchangeable, but for the purpose of this video, that's what we're talking about with bushcraft. And we're working with this price range of under $50, so at that price range, we're not getting the top quality materials. We're not getting any kind of extremely amazing steel. That being said, a lot of what is needed for wilderness living and bushcraft doesn't take those high-tech materials and that kind of thing. So with a lot of gear and equipment, your budget category a lot of times is kind of represents an entry-level kind of thing. But for these knives, a lot of these, you can use these well beyond entry level. These are good knives. One more thing before we get into the knives, I have two knives here, the Steel SRK and the ESEE Izula. Very different from the rest of these knives, and I'll talk more about that later. There's a reason I put them on the list. Again, some of this will come down to personal preference, but for me personally, a blade length of around 4 to 4.5 inches and ideally a Scandinavian type grind is what I like for bushcraft. So those two knives I just mentioned stray from that, but I included them because they can work depending on how you roll and your environment and your approach to bushcraft. We all have our different approach. For example, some of us are carrying an axe or a saw or a hatchet, that kind of thing. Some of us rarely use the knife. Some of us use the knife for everything. So all those things are going to come into play. Also your environment. When I lived in the desert in Arizona, completely different game as far as what kind of knives I wanted to carry and what worked best out there. A long blade out there in the desert just didn't make any sense, so I kept it really small there and it worked fine. Here in Alaska it's a little bit different, not so much in this alpine tundra area, but down in the more forested areas I definitely like a little bit more blade. So all right, let's get into the knives. As I go into these, I'll talk about the specs of each knife, and then I'll share some of my personal experience with them and try to just give you an idea how they feel and how they function. Again, a lot of this is going to come down to what's going to work best for you. So hopefully by sharing what I can about them and giving you some close-up shots of these knives, it will help you make a decision if you're considering buying one of these 10 knives. All right, up first, let's talk about the Mora Companion. It's a pretty popular knife in the bushcraft world. Quick rundown on the specs. Overall length is 8.6 inches. The blade length is 4.1 inches. We've got a blade thickness of just 2 millimeters. The grind, it's a Scandinavian grind. On this top 10 list, I actually have 3 of the 10 knives are actually from the same company. I got the Mora Companion, the Mora HD, and the Mora Bushcraft Black. I'll get into those specifically later, and I'll try to talk a little bit about some of the differences between the 3 because they're all very similar, but I included all 3 of them on this list because it's hard to beat these, especially for the price. This one is almost always under $15. That's pretty cheap, but you can't usually get a $15 knife that's going to perform the way this knife does, and so that's why it makes this list. So let's look at the blade here first. The profile of the blade, specifically the blade height from the spine to the edge, is pretty narrow, and that combined with this 2 millimeter thickness, it makes this blade it really gets into those tight places and gets some work done. That point slenders in there pretty good. you have just a very subtle drop point going on here. So that spine doesn't go perfectly flat. It drops a little there towards the point. Really works well for small work. This is a very light blade too. Part of that's due to the fact that there's just not a whole lot of steel here. It's also a partial tang knife. All three of the Moras that I'm reviewing here are partial tang knives. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You can do a lot with these knives. There's some reasons that I do like a full tang knife, and I'll get into that later, but these are good dependable knives. The handle of this blade has some nice contours, kind of drops down here and has just a little bit of belly on the underside, and it fits nice in your hand. I wear a size large in gloves, and this fits pretty good. Now if you have bigger hands, or if you generally prefer just a thicker handle, you might want to look at the Mora Companion HD, because it does have a bigger handle. I'll show you that in a second. But overall, this knife will get a lot of work done. That thin blade really slices into things, and it's noticeably slicey. The sheath it's just a simple plastic sheath. It's molded so the knife clicks in there. There's a little thumb ramp here so you can remove the knife single-handed, and then on the back there's a molded belt clip. One thing I like about these knives, and it's sometimes something that goes unnoticed, but there's a little bit of breathing room here around the blade. Some knives are molded so close to the blade that there's no room for breathing, and the reason I like that is because personally I prefer these high carbon steel blades, and those are prone to corrosion if they get wet. Storing your knife in a wet sheath that has no breathing room, you're basically soaking your knife in that water. And not only that, once you take it home and try to maintain that blade, you know, clean it, dry it off, you rinse your sheath out, it's hard to air dry these things unless they have this amount of breathing room. With this one, I can shake it off. I can even shove a little towel down in there and try to dry off some of it, and then they air dry fairly well. It takes me a little longer to air dry you know, like a tight Kydex sheath that's molded right around the blade. There's also a drain hole in the bottom, so that's also helpful for those purposes. Moving on to the Mora HD. This one's going to look very similar to the Mora Companion because it's nearly identical with just a few dimension changes. Let me get into the specs real quick, and then I'll talk about the knife. The overall length here is 8.7 inches. We've got a blade length of 4.2 inches. Blade thickness is 3.2 inches. And again, we got that Scandinavian grind and the ABS material on the handle. So as I said, there's a lot in common between this and the Companion. This is, as the name implies, literally just a heavier duty version of the Companion. You gain a little bit of length in the handle, more belly down here, so it makes it a thicker handle, so it fills out your hand a little more. The blade is a little longer, but barely noticeable. The biggest difference in the blade is that thickness. We bumped up from 2 millimeters to 3.2 millimeters, and that does make a noticeable difference. It is stiffer and a little more robust. When you're making deep cuts, you feel the difference. This one remains stiff, where if you're making a similar cut with the regular model of the Companion, you feel almost a little flex in that blade. Now I haven't had any problems with the Mora Companion. The blade's never busted on me, even during heavy duty tasks, but this one does have a little more to it, just more steel. The one thing I liked seeing here is that they did bring the grind height up on that Scandinavian grind. That's essential if you want to keep the same angle that we all love about the Mora Companion. Once you make that thicker blade stock, you have to go higher with the grind in order to achieve that angle. And they did that on some knives. I've seen them take a popular top-selling knife and try to make a different version of it, and by shrinking it or making it a heavy duty like this, and they fail to maintain that grind, and you lose what you loved about the knife in the first place. So I liked seeing that they brought that grind level up, because it cuts nice and get deep with that first initial cut. You start to notice the difference once you reach that 3.2 millimeter blade stock. That's where it starts to change. So just a little heavier duty knife, Definitely recommend this if you have bigger hands or you like the bigger grip, or if you just want something that gives you a little more assurance and peace of mind that you got a heavier duty blade on there. I've used both of these knives, the HD version and the companion version, quite a bit, and I haven't had a problem with either one. I would say if you do a lot of like finer carving tasks and things like that, the regular companion model is a little more enjoyable just because it's just so thin and just gets in there, whereas this becomes almost unnecessary amount of thickness. And with the Mora Companion HD, you get the same exact looking sheath as the Mora Companion comes with, so no differences there. The last of the three knives from Mora is the Mora Bushcraft Black. This one has a overall length of 9.15 inches. The blade length is 4.3 inches. The blade thickness is 3.2 inches. And again, we got that Scandinavian grind going on. Now this knife does bump up in price from the other two Moras. You can almost get 3 of the Mora Companions for the price of this one. We're looking at around $40 for this knife. So it's worth looking at it and seeing some of the features. If you don't need the added features that are on the Mora Bushcraft Black, then you don't need to spend the money. Personally, I like a lot of what's going on here. So let's get into this. Looking at the blade, it's 4.3 inches, so it's a little longer than the other two Moras we looked at. You'll notice that it's black. Now that's a DLC finish, which stands for diamond-like coating. I really like this finish because it doesn't, unlike powder coatings that add some bulk to the blade, and which translates to more friction in your cuts, this does not. It's bonded to the steel. It's part of the steel now, and so far it's proved to be really tough, and it's holding up well. So I like that, and the reason this is on here is because this is a carbon steel blade, and so that's going to help prevent some of that corrosion. Other than that, we got a very similar blade profile that we've already seen on the Mora Companion and Companion HD. We have the same thickness as the Companion HD, so 3.2 millimeters. Another feature on the Bushcraft Black that you don't get with the other two Mora Companions is the spine of this knife is ground to a 90-degree angle, so you can scrape your ferro rod with it, shave off tinder, scrape cactus spines, whatever you want to do with it. There's all kinds of different purposes for that. Personally, I really like having a 90-degree spine on my knives, as I find I use it quite a bit, and it saves your edge from having to get worn. And there's just some tasks that spine works really well for. Cleaning scales off the fish, lots of things. So having that on there to me is an added benefit. And that's something you don't get on the Mora Companion models. Now moving to the handle, this is where it changes quite a bit. It's a different profile there on the handle, and instead of using that ABS plastic stuff, they've moved to a TPE rubber, which is noticeably more grippy. It's got a nice tacky feel to it. In my grip testing with this was my grippiest knife of all. I had it covered in water, mud, and even some gooey algae. And this was by far the grippiest of all the knife handles, even when it was wet like that. That TPE rubber, it's almost like it has a little bit of give there, and so it just kind of clings on. It's really good material. I like it. The other thing that helps you stay in is this. There's this little indentation here where the index finger can go. Separates the index finger from the middle finger. At first I didn't really like that because I don't like a lot going on my handle contours, because I want to be able to choke up on the knife and use it that way. But as I worked with it more, I found that it didn't really get in my way. And what I liked about it was that it let me, when it was wet, that added to that secure grip. Not only did that tacky TPE rubber help, but it locks that one finger in there good, and kind of gives it a place to hang out. And so really gives you a secure grip. The handle length is about the same length as the Mora Companion HD. So again, this fuller handle, you don't notice it as much during the smaller tasks, but when you get working for extended amount of time or doing heavy cuts, that's where it really starts to make sense. The sheath for the Mora Bushcraft Black is similar to the ones that the Mora Companion and the Mora Companion HD have. It's just a little bit different profile there. Still has the breathable blade space, the drain hole there. This one has a molded belt loop, but it swivels off and can swap with a full loop. So instead of clipping on, you can thread it on. Just depends on your personal preference there. Next up, we got the Cold Steel Fin Hawk. Let's go over the basic specs on here. We got an overall length of 8.5 inches, a blade length of 4 inches even, and the blade thickness is 2.7 millimeters. This is Scandinavian grind, and this is German 4116 steel. So right away, looking at the blade profile, you can see that we have a completely flat blade spine, no drop. And what that does is that allows the edge to have to come up to meet it, giving you a little more belly than you would have in a drop point knife. Both knife styles have their advantages. Having a little extra belly is always nice if you're skinning animals or dressing game, that kind of thing. But it also works for woodwork too. In those longer sweeping cuts, it follows that sweeping motion and continues your cut, and so it feels good for those. This one has a I'm not sure the exact angle on the Scandinavian grind here, but it's ground pretty high, and so you have a nice tall grind there, and it slices in and it cuts deep. I was pulling away quite a bit of material when I was working with it, when I was doing deep cuts. Made it nice to work with. The handle material on this is a 2-layer system. There's a high impact polypropylene that's molded around the blade, and then over that it's encased in a thermoplastic rubber. And that thermoplastic rubber around the outside gives a little more of a grippiness to it, and it also is coated with these little horizontal kind of wavy lines on there to give it a little more texture. One thing that I found interesting when I was doing tests with it in the water and in the mud, I noticed that although a lot of those features did contribute to its grippiness, what I found was really keeping me secure was this slight indentation that runs most of the length of the blade here. Now what happened was once my hands were wet and muddy and I was working with this, when it really started to need a little more grip, I found that my fingers, mostly my middle finger and my ring finger, found that little indentation and kind of were able to lock into there. So it's a very subtle feature. You don't notice it most of the time when you're using it, but it works pretty well at what it's doing. Now the other thing is back here on the back of the handle, there's a little indentation here. Works great for a reverse grip. Not something I use a ton for bushcraft things, but every now and then you need to spike this into a log if you're doing pull cuts that way, or splitting roots, just different things you want to have the knife fixed and move the object that you're cutting with. So and it doesn't get in the way of anything else, so it's not a bad feature to have on there. The sheath is going to be similar to what we've seen with the Mora sheaths. Little molded clip here on the back, some breathing room around the blade, drain hole in the bottom. It clicks in there pretty well. Actually, really good retention here. One thing I would have liked to see here is a thumb ramp like we have on the Moras that lets you draw this one-handed. It's a little hard to draw it one-handed, especially because it's got a good amount of retention on there. So what I usually had to do is grab the sheath with one hand and draw it with the other. Not too big of a deal, but it is nice to have the option to single hand draw your knife from time to time. All right, let's look at this Cold Steel SRK. This is a very different knife from some of the other ones that we've been looking at. Like I said in the beginning, this one strays from what I typically prefer as a bushcraft knife, but at around $40, you're getting a lot of knife for the price. And the big reason why I included this on this list is that for some people, this style of knife is going to fit them better. I'll explain a little bit more about that. Let's get into the specs real quick. This is a much larger blade, overall length of 10.75 inches, blade length of 6 inches. We have a 5 millimeter blade thickness here. And instead of a Scandinavian grind like some of those other knives, we got a saber grind. The handle material is Cold Steel's Crayex. So looking at the blade first, we have a drop point, just a nice angle that drops down there. And there's a 90-degree spine there on the top. Big old thick 5mm blade thickness. The 90-degree spine continues along until it makes that drop. From that point, it makes almost like a wedge shape. Now that makes it great for stabbing, but you're not typically stabbing a lot of things in most bushcraft tasks. And one thing that I don't like about that little wedge shape is that if I'm batoning, which this knife is just so beastie, and it's got the length that it is a good batoner and it'll take the beating, but that's one thing I don't like about it, is that wedge eats up your baton pretty well. You can still do it, you can still baton, it's fine, but it's that is something that I noticed there. The saber grind, this is a good grind. What you have here is you have the blade stock comes all the way to about here, and then you drop into kind of more of a flat grind, and then you finish with this V edge. Saber grinds are great for kind of an all-purpose thing, which is, this knife is really a little bit more of a survival knife than it is a bushcraft knife. And I know I said in the beginning that I wanted to make that distinction, but like I say, for some people this knife is going to work better for them. Specifically those who tend to use their knife for everything, and they don't grab those bigger tools for much. Obviously, when you get into tasks of smaller carving and things like that, this is going to feel different in hand than one of those smaller knives. That being said, this isn't that heavy of a knife. It's a big old thick blade stock and a long blade, but it's light. So you can do those smaller tasks. You're not going to be able to chop much with it. If you choke back here, you can do some light chopping with it, but don't expect it to be a full-on chopper. You can choke up on it reasonably well and use it. So for being a big blade, it can be used for those smaller tasks. When it comes to crafting wood and carving and those kind of things, making those notches, that Scandinavian grind is always going to be preferred. It's just the most efficient way to do it. But where the saber grind really shines is that it's just an all-purpose knife. It doesn't really do anything super well, but it can do anything. So that's something that this kind of knife does well. The blade steel on this knife is SK5. Now this is what puts it in our $50 range for this list. If you like this knife and you want to upgrade the steel, there's other steels available, but it definitely bumps the cost up. For most purposes though, this SK5 is doing okay, so it's a good way to try it out. At around $40 you can find out if you like this style blade, and always upgrade it from there. The handle, not a whole lot going on here. It's a simple shaped handle, but it feels okay in hand. It feels good, and it's plenty grippy. This material is pretty hard, and a lot of times with harder material that means it's slicker, but they did a good job with all this texturing around the handle, and that texturing is soft enough that it doesn't cut into your hand, but it is aggressive enough that it hangs on there. So even when it's wet, it does do a good job. This is a bigger knife, obviously. The grind doesn't yield itself as good to woodworking tasks. So you really have to look at what you're doing most with your knife, how you use it, what other tools you're bringing along. And that's why I wanted this knife on the list, because for some people this is going to be the only knife they'd go with, because it works for them. The sheath that comes with this, it clicks in there. There's good enough retention with just this alone, but on this belt loop piece there's also a loop and snap to hold that upper handle, which the extra retention is always nice, but what I really like it is that it keeps your handle from getting caught when you're pushing through alders or brush or different things like that. So it keeps everything secure there. You got a belt loop in the back, and there's a Velcro and a snap to secure it, so you can get it on and off without having to remove your belt and thread it through. There's also plenty of other little eyelets and strap slots here, so you can rig this thing up however you want, whether you're strapping it to your pack or want to make a leg drop deal. You can do all kinds of things with it. Pretty versatile sheath. This knife is from Condor Knife and Tools. It's the Terrasaur. Kind of interesting name there. Specs on this knife: overall length of 8.8 inches. The blade is 4.2 inches at 3 millimeters thick. This is 1095 high carbon steel. The handle's made out of a high impact polypropylene. All right, looking at the blade profile, you can see that there is a slight drop. It almost looks like it's horizontal. It doesn't drop a whole lot. And that tip, this is one thing that I like about this knife personally, is this tip drops to just above center line with the knife. Now when it drops to center line, I like that style of knives too. And they yield themselves really well to drilling tasks and just really knowing where the tip of your knife is at. But I kind of like it to be just a little above that center line, because what that does is it lets you have it higher for batoning tasks. You don't have a ton of length in here, so you're not batoning anything crazy, but it does make this a little more efficient at batoning. Once you start dropping that spine downward more, your hits with the baton are starting to fall, or that they're not transferring energy as much. It's subtle, but I like knives, and so those subtle things are cool. And so that's one thing I like about this knife, is that tip drops almost to center line, but not quite. What that also does is it gives you a good amount of straight edge before it starts to curve. I like having a lot of straight edge for woodworking. The more belly you have in a knife, the more you can use it for skinning tasks and dressing animals and things like that. But the majority of my tasks often involve wood, and so I'm happy to have the compromise there, to have it be less effective at those tasks and more effective at what I do most, which is working with wood. This blade profile is a nice kind of pointy, slender kind of deal, similar to what we see with the Moras. And what I like about that is it allows you to get in to those small places and do some detailed work. The handle on this, first of all, it's made of the high impact polypropylene. It's kind of a harder material, so there's not as much, there's not that subtle give to it like what we saw on the Bushcraft Black from Mora. So because of that, it doesn't have that tackiness and that extra grip. This is still grippy, and in my wet testing, this was probably the least secure of all the knives. It was still fine. I still wouldn't hesitate to use it in wet conditions, but it was a little less grippy. The texturing, these little diamond patterns that are featured on both sides of it, end up being what really saves it and keeps it hanging on there. The handle shape, I actually really like this kind of handle shape. There's not much contour in it. It's pretty boring, but it's comfortable enough in use. And what I really like about a good boring handle like this is you can choke up without anything getting in the way. You can do pinch grips, you can do all kinds of grips with this, and it doesn't interfere with what you're trying to do. So I really like that. This is a full tang knife, so that steel runs all the way through it, giving it a little more structural support. Now, as I mentioned before with the knives from Mora, a full tang isn't always necessary on a bushcraft knife. Personally, I like it, and I got two reasons for that. One, it does make it a sturdier knife, and while that's true, you're really not going to notice that very often, because unless you're almost abusing the knife, you're never going to have a problem with a partial tang knife, provided that it's made well like the Moras are. The other thing that a full tang knife does is, if for any reason you destroyed your handle, you still have steel running through there that you can still hang on to. It can still function as a handle, or you could wrap it in paracord, or you can even craft yourself a new handle out of what's available in the field. That situation has actually never come up for me, but just the way my brain works, I like knowing that I have that option with the full tang knife, and this one has it. The sheath on the Condor Terrasaur is similar to what we've seen in the Moras, but with some interesting differences. It still has that breathable space around the blade. We got 2 drain holes. This is actually an ambidextrous sheath, so whether you want it right hand or left hand drawable, it clicks in there. And then instead of a molded belt loop on the back, they went with a leather loop. Good, secure, functional sheath though. Next up, we got another knife from Condor. This is the Condor Bushlore. Very comfortable knife to use. Let's get into the specs real quick and then we'll break this knife down a bit. Total length on this is 9.3 inches. The blade length is 4.3 inches and 3 millimeters thick. This is a Scandinavian grind and it's made out of 1075 high carbon steel. The handle is made from walnut and is fastened with these brass rivets. This blade shape, we can see that we got a good amount of drop on the spine here, bringing that tip right to center line. And we talked about this a little bit already. It really works well for those drilling motions, and you'll find that it gives you good awareness of where the tip of your knife is. One thing that's kind of interesting is that if you look closely, the grind on this knife, instead of following almost a horizontal and then curving toward the tip of the knife, there's a slight curve all for the whole length of the blade. You don't really notice it much when you're carving with it, but it does make those long sweeping cuts more efficient because it's literally moving at the ideal angle with you for the whole length of that stroke. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's a very subtle detail, but it functions well, yeah, without making it too specialized of a blade. The handle on this is incredibly comfortable. I get a little hesitant whenever there's extra contours in a knife handle because I like to be able to use whatever grip I want and not have these bulbous curves being in my way. But this handle is really amazing. It's very comfortable. It's got the belly, a little bit of belly here. And then when you look at it from this angle, you can see that there's a little bit of subtle contouring here. What that does is it really fits well in the hand, and it still doesn't get in my way with anything. I choked up on this. I mean, this pinch grip I can do all kinds of things with this pinch grip, and nothing's getting into my way. So I was able to, move it in all kinds of different positions when I was working with it, and it just functioned really well. Another thing about this handle, this walnut wood has been sanded so that it meets with the exposed tang of the blade. A lot of times, especially at knives at this price range, you don't see that. They just are kind of slopped together. But as you run your hand across from the wooden handle over that exposed tang, you don't feel it raised up anywhere, nothing to an extreme degree anyway. I've had knives before where they protrude a little bit, and with extended use that isn't fun to work with. It starts digging in and making hot spots. So a lot of good attention to detail on this. Another thing I like about this handle, and this might be a personal preference thing, but I found it very comfortable, is that we have a horizontal line here. It doesn't drop until the very butt of the knife. And I find that especially for the longer sessions that I worked with this, that was nice. Looking at one of the Moras, for example, which is also a comfortable handle, there's that subtle drop near the back. A lot of knife handles have that, and it is comfortable. But that was just something I noticed when working with this knife, is that I actually really liked that straight edge. It made it nice and secure, and during the big cuts, I liked it. So, got a little lanyard hole here in the back. The biggest thing I noticed when working with this knife was just how comfortable it was, regardless of what grip I took. And again, I really like this profile blade. Functions really well. My only issue with this knife, and I have a hard time saying this because I actually really like this handle, but I'm not always a fan of wooden handles just because they take a little more maintenance. I like to know that I can beat my gear up and it'll keep on going. And because this is fastened with these rivets, if anything does happen to the handle, I'd probably just buy a new knife instead of trying to cut those rivets and redo the handle. So that is one thing, is that you gotta treat this. You gotta oil these up every now and then, especially if they get soaked in water or exposed to different elements, or they will start to dry out and crack. That being said, this handle is going to last a long time, so it's almost a non-issue. But yeah, just the way that I am, I kind of like my stuff to be able to outlast me. The sheath that comes with the Condor Bushlore is a very nice leather sheath, nice craftsmanship here. It's a good thick leather. It's got the two fasteners here. Stitching looks great. Little belt loop on the back. I mean, fairly simple sheath, but it's a nice looking sheath. It's well made, so I appreciate that. All right, up next is a knife from BPS Knives. This is actually the first time I'd worked with knives from BPS Knives, and I actually got two on the list. There's a lot of value in them. There's a lot going on with these knives, and the cost is just crazy low. This one is the BPS BS1FTS. So let's look at the specs here. We have an overall length of 7.87 inches. Blade length is 3.5 inches. Blade thickness 2 millimeters. You got a Scandinavian grind, and the steel is 1066. And this handle is made out of ash, and it's fastened with these little bolts. You can remove them with a hex key. So this knife comes in at around $20. So that's one of the reasons I made this list. It's a full tang knife, decent materials going on, and it functioned well with the tests. I had my doubts about this little guy, but it actually did quite well. When you look at this knife, it's a pretty small one, especially compared to some of the other ones. You know, that blade is only 3.5 inches, and the blade is the same thickness as the Mora Companion, so we get a very slicey blade. I purposely put it to work in removing large amounts of material because I wanted to see how it did with like deep cuts, because while I know that this knife will do well in crafting small things and making little notches and, you know, figure 4 trap sets, that kind of thing, I wanted to see how it did at some of the bigger tasks, because otherwise it may or may not have a place with my gear. But when I put it to work with those, taking those big deep cuts, it actually did surprisingly well, and a lot of that was contributed to this thin little blade. It just sliced in deep and made it through. And then because the blade height is narrow also, you can pull out of those cuts very easy without any twist on the blade. It actually works well for, it's just a tiny little knife, but it cuts deep and does some good work. Looking at the blade profile here, you can see that it's a drop point almost to center line, and it doesn't drop until near the very tip of the blade, so it leaves you a good amount of straight edge, and then just that last little piece going in there. So then that's where you can get in there and drill and do those kind of tasks. But for being a shorter blade like this, it's kind of nice to have that flat section of cutting edge extend the way it does, because then you make the most of a small blade. Moving on to the handle, it's got decent contours in here that for the small knife that it is and the type of work you'd be doing with this, fits in there pretty good. There's no crazy overlap between the exposed tang and the handle, which again I was surprised to see for a knife at this price. I like that these handles are removable, because I can refit this with something else if this wood goes downhill, or I split it or bust it or something like that. This is a smaller handle though, and again, it's not too big of a deal for me. My hand fits it okay, but it definitely fills the whole thing. The kind of work that I generally be doing with this knife, it's not going to really come into play. I don't tend to need a bigger, thicker handle until I'm doing those heavier tasks. But if you have bigger hands, again, my hand size, I wear a size large in gloves. If you have bigger hands, or if you generally prefer a bigger handle, this is going to feel kind of small. On the other side of that, if you have smaller hands, this might be great, because it is, I mean, the distance between here and here isn't a whole lot, and then it's also thin in this direction too, so it's just kind of a tiny knife. But again, it works great for that. So one of the reasons I wanted to include this on this list is because of the difference in how people approach their bushcraft tasks and their wilderness living, is that they, if you have bigger tools that you tend to use and you want to have an edge tool for doing some smaller work and then you're reaching for the bigger tools for almost everything else, this might fit great with your kit. But again, even though this is kind of designed for those smaller tasks, it does have that full tang, and the blade was holding up reasonably well, and like I say, it was slicing into those deeper cuts, and you know, I kind of beat it up a little bit just to see what it'd do, and it held up fine. So interesting little knife, pretty inexpensive too, but it gets the job done. Comes with this sheath, which I'm not really a fan of too much, but again, for this kind of knife, it fits what it needs to do. It just kind of slides in there, has reasonably good retention in there. It's a little floppy compared to other sheaths that I've used, but again, for this style of knife, it protects the blade and it seems to be stitched well. I think it'll be just fine for this particular knife. Another knife from BPS Knives. This is the HK1S. The overall length on this knife is 8.66 inches. The blade length is 4.3 inches with a thickness of 2.7 millimeters. It's a Scandinavian ground knife made of 1066 carbon steel. The handle is made out of walnut. And again, like the other BPS knife, it's fastened with those bolts that can be removed with an Allen wrench. All right, looking at the blade of this, we can see that this is a different style blade than the other BPS knife for sure, and actually a little different from all the ones that I've shown so far. This knife is geared toward hunters with this pronounced belly here at the end, but with the Scandinavian grind, it works well for bushcraft as well. And so I included this on the list, especially for those who tend to do a lot of skinning or field dressing of animals, that kind of thing where you want to have that extra belly in there, because this knife provides that without it being so specific of a knife that it can only be used for hunting. This still worked well with the other bushcraft tasks that I put it through. Looking closer at this knife, we see that it has just a little bit of a drop here, but not a whole lot, which I like that, because if you're wanting to have some belly on your knife, which this knife is designed to have, you want the cutting edge to be able to rise up to meet your tip. But I do like that it drops down a little bit. But if you look at the belly here, this curved portion, it actually drops below the horizontal cutting edge here. And so it is quite pronounced. Again, when in regular carving tasks, it didn't get in the way or feel weird or anything. I wasn't able to do any skinning or field dressing or any kind of things like that, but I did use it in the kitchen to separate the skin off some raw halibut, which is kind of a thick skin, and it was nice to be able to take kind of a pinch grip here, which the handle let me do so, and just slice away at that with this extra belly here in it, and it really did well. I was able to just make short work of that and get it done. It's got a little bit of jimping here on the spine for resting your thumb on there and having a little extra secure grip, and this is a nice sharp 90-degree edge on this knife too. The handle is comfortable. It fills out your hand better than that other BPS knife. Again, that was a much smaller style of knife. This one's got a little bit of a drop here to fill the hand, but it is, even though it does fill the hand better, it's thicker in this dimension as well. The length of the handle doesn't give you a whole lot to work with. So again, if your hands are bigger than mine, this might start to feel small. And just like the other BPS knife, I like that I can pull this handle off with an Allen wrench if I want to refit it with a different handle, or if this gets damaged or something. There's also a little lanyard hole here on the back. The sheath that this knife comes with, it's a good durable sheath. It's got a dangler on the back as well as the regular belt loop. It holds the knife pretty deep in there, so it secures it well. I was glad to see that for this style of knife that BPS went with a little more durable sheath. And last up, we got the ESEE Izula. This is the other knife that strays from my normal 4 to 4.5 inch blade Scandinavian grind kind of bushcraft knife. This knife isn't going to be for everyone, and that's clear from just looking at it, but I want to talk about why I included it on this list. But first, basic specs on this knife. The overall length is 6.25 inches. The blade length is 2.875 inches, and it's 3.96 millimeters at the thickest point. This is a flat ground blade, and it's made of 1095 high carbon steel. All right, so getting into the blade specifics, this is definitely a different kind of knife, especially for bushcraft. There's no doubt that if you've ever used an ESEE Izula before, that it's a handy little blade. But for bushcraft, this is not going to be for everyone. But it's worth considering because for some, this might be exactly what's needed. This is a very small blade, like I say, only 2.875 inches, but it's reasonably thick for what it is, and it can get the job done. There's not a whole lot of straight edge on the cutting edge here because we have just a subtle drop from the spine, and because it's not a very long blade, there ends up being quite a bit of belly here. Now for the smaller work that this is designed for, that usually doesn't matter too much, and actually this curvature here works well for skinning tasks, and I actually cleaned several trout with it the other day, and it worked pretty well, and the lack of handle actually worked well too, because I was able to just really get a good little pinch grip on here and just make my cuts, so it was nice to work with a little bit of jimping on the back of the spine too. Now obviously handle wise there is no handle except for this skeletonized tang here, so that you're definitely going to feel that if you're doing a lot of cutting on some heavy things. There's nowhere for this thing to go. You got to lock it in and it's just going to dig in. So if you're doing light work, it's fine, you don't notice it at all, but heavy work you're definitely going to feel that. One of the things that I did with each of these knives was carve a tent stake, because it's just a simple task that allowed me to just see how it did with removing material, making a point, making a notch. Just a simple task, but I ran each of these knives through that. When I used this one, I purposely used a big thick piece of wood so that I was forced to remove a lot of material and really see how that was. It was not very enjoyable. The flat grind does okay with removing material, not the same as the Scandinavian grind, but the biggest issue was just that handle cutting into my hand. Now I did wrap it with paracord later on. That does improve the comfort of it quite a bit, but it's still not going to feel anything like the Condor, for example. This is a dedicated handle, so that's going to be different. The minimalist style blade though has its benefits. For one, when I was cleaning the fish, I didn't have to worry about anything soaking into my handle material. I was able to just rinse the whole thing out afterward. And it's just going to be a lighter, smaller blade. Part of the reason that I included this knife on the list is because in my personal experience when I lived in the desert, it was different than this. I didn't need very much blade, and I kept finding that something like this was all that I needed, and it actually worked very well. And this 1095 steel holds up very well. If you know about ESEE knives, they have their unconditional, no questions asked, lifetime guarantee on their blades. So you can really test these knives out and see what they're capable of. And in my experience, they were capable of quite a bit. I've beat this thing up quite a bit. Actually, not this particular one. In the desert, I used an Izula 2, but it has the same blade length as this knife here, and this one fits within our $50 budget. So again, with this knife, you're looking at some very unique features, and you have to ask yourself if this is sufficient for you, because it is kind of a minimalist approach. It's a smaller blade, and so it just depends on your environment, on how you roll, and on what else is in your kit. But one thing to note about this blade, this 1095 steel combined with the thickness of this blade here, it'll take a beating, and you can, I mean, I've batoned it through things before, like to make notches or to make cuts that I just couldn't by hand with this because it's too small, and it continues to take it. It's a surprisingly tough little knife. Now one feature too is that this knife for the same price can come with a powder coating to help prevent corrosion on this high carbon steel. That powder coating is more resistant to corrosion than what I chose here, which is a black oxide finish. Now the black oxide finish, you do have to be a little more careful with it because it can corrode easier, but it's a treatment that lays flatter to the blade, and so you have reduced friction when you're making that cut. That's a good trade-off for me. So for what it does, it's a good little knife. Now the sheath that this knife comes with is just a basic molded sheath here. The knife clicks in with very good retention. Personally, I really like to run a piece of paracord through the loop here. I hook it to my belt loop and just drop it into my pocket. That's how I carry this. But the knife also comes with a metal clip that is removable, that fastens onto here, so you can clip it on to your belt or your pack. Time for some final thoughts and maybe some recommendations here. As I mentioned already, we got the Steel SRK and the ESEE Izula. Both of these are kind of the outliers on this list. I put these on the list because for some people, based on their environment and how they roll and what else is in their kit, one of these knives might be the right things. These represent different ends of the spectrum. The small, very minimal blade, and this kind of all-purpose, beefy, kind of survival style blade. So you really need to weigh out whether or not that's what you're looking for if you're thinking about buying one of these knives. Other than that, the other recommendation that I have is to decide whether or not you want a full tang knife. The 3 Moras that we looked at and the Cold Steel Finhawk, each of these knives are partial tang. So you want to decide if a full tang is important to you. That being said, it might be worth trying one of these knives, especially one of the less expensive ones. We got the Mora Companion for less than $15, and the Finhawk runs at about $20. But try one of these out for a fairly low cost and find out if that partial tang is a problem for you. Like I say, I've never busted steel through the handle of the knife or anything, and I've even tried being a little abusive on some of these just to see how they work for my own education, and they hold up very well. I personally like a full tang knife, but these are all really good knives, and they're very nice to use. All 4 of these are light, and they're excellent bushcraft knives. So, and at the cost, it's hard to beat them. The other one that I might say that to consider maybe not getting is this the one from BPS. This is the BS 1FTS. This is a good little knife, but as I mentioned when we talked about it earlier, it is a smaller knife, and so if that's what you're looking for, this is a great knife. If not, just know that that's what's going on here. So that leaves us with these other ones. You know, this one is one to consider maybe if you want that extra belly, if you're doing a lot of hunting with it and you want it to be capable of that. But again, both of these BPS knives, it's a little bit smaller in the handle length, and so if you have bigger hands, you might want to stay away from those. Both of these Condors I really enjoyed working with. Very comfortable, full tang also. I'd say that for me, my 3 favorites would be the Mora Bushcraft Black, the Condor Terrasaur, and the Condor Bushlore. Those ones are the ones that met my needs personally for bushcraft the most. So any of those 3 knives I'd be happy to head out into the wilderness with. Hopefully this video has been helpful in giving you some information about these knives that I selected and tested. They've all been great to work with. Like I say, aside from these 2 knives, the SRK and the Izula, which are kind of specialty knives, the rest of these I wouldn't hesitate to recommend for bushcraft and wilderness living type tasks.